Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Desforges. I'm the director of the Independent Cinema Office, and I'm here to welcome you to this evening's event on the Cinema of Ideas. If you haven't been before, the Cinema of Ideas is the ICO's virtual screen, a forum for collaboration, discussion and film. A particularly warm welcome and thank you to audiences from our partner cinemas and to any of our international viewers. I hope that wherever you are, that the time difference isn't too tiring or too onerous. Thank you also to the British Film Institute who fund us to do this work on the platform. And just to remind you that tonight's session is being live captioned. So thank you so much to Andrew, who's our captioner this evening. We'll also have a recording of this event, which will be available on the Cinema of Ideas website to watch alongside recordings of our previous discussions. I just wanted to mention that coming up on the Cinema of Ideas next week, we've got a fantastic collaboration with the Black Film Bulletin on the gaze. This is a 3-day event from the 25th to the 27th of January, a collection of short films by trailblazing Black filmmakers from the African Caribbean diaspora, curated by the editors of the Black Film Bulletin magazine. The collection is presented alongside And This Too Shall Pass, Decolonizing Film, a video essay revisiting the early history of the Black Film Bulletin, and a live Q&A with founding editor of the Black Film Bulletin, Dr. June Giovanni, and writer Jennifer G. Robinson at 6:30 on Wednesday, the 26th of January. But back to this evening, I'm delighted to welcome back curator, programmer, writer and filmmaker Tony Rayns and Simon Ward, our friend and ICO trustee in discussion. Those of you who were here last time will remember what a great conversation it was, and we have been so looking forward to continuing it. So it's really nice to have you both back. Thank you so much. I'll leave you with Simon for now, and I'll see you again at the end of this event.
Thanks, Catherine. So this is part 2 of our conversation. We initially were trying to compress 50 years plus of programming from Tony here into 1 hour, and we managed to get through, I think, about 10 years. So I hope anyone who's watching this has already seen the first one we did, the first conversation we did. If not, as Catherine says, these are online on the ICO's website, on the Cinema of Ideas website, and you can look at them anytime, you can watch it. But tonight we're going to start in about 1985. And we're going to kick off with your, I think, second sort of review of Chinese cinema, which you did in London as the Electric Shadows program, the second one. Mm-hmm. And I suppose what I'd like to sort of ask you is, at that point, 1985, you've been to Hong Kong, you're starting to see more work from China, and you've done the Electric Shadows. What comes next?
I'd been to a lot of countries by 1985. I'd been a regular visitor to the Hong Kong Film Festival from the late 70s onwards. And I think I missed 1 year for health reasons, but otherwise was there reliably year on year. And in Hong Kong, I saw lots and lots of East Asian films from Thailand, from Indonesia, from the Philippines, from Korea, many countries in the region. And including quite a lot of Japanese films that would have been otherwise closed to me. Films I wouldn't have had a chance to see in Europe. And it was all very educational, and it led travels to other countries in the region. At the same time, our first Electric Shadows event at the National Film Theatre in London had attracted quite a lot of attention in cinematheques around the world, and people were starting to follow suit. And it became easier in the early 1980s because the China Film Archive reopened. When I think I described last time how we went to Beijing, Scott Meek and I, looking for access to Chinese film history, essentially, and were thwarted because the archive had no building, it didn't even have an office. We did meet the personnel. They were very apologetic and said, look, sorry, our vaults were locked up and the keys were thrown away during the Cultural Revolution to prevent any films from being damaged by rampaging Red Guards. and we're not yet ready to reopen. We're not reorganized. We're going to have our own new building. We're going to have proper facilities. We're going to have our own cinema. Everything is going to be new and much better, but not yet. So we were thwarted. And as I think I said last time, in response, we looked to Shanghai, where we did find that the Shanghai film studios and Shanghai film organizations generally had kept some prints of some of their classics. They had survived the Cultural Revolution, presumably not shown, but they were happy to dig them out to show them to us. So we were able to see a few films like Street Angel from 37, like Spring River Flows East from 47. We got our first taste of classic Chinese cinema, and we were able to bring it to London. By the early 80s, the archive had reopened, and cinematheques around the world were all clamoring to show Chinese films. There was a big event, a one-off event in the city of Torino, Turin, in northern Italy, which Scott Meek and I attended. We were invited to join its organizing committee, or its advisory committee rather. For something like 2 weeks, we watched 5 or 6 old Chinese films a day.
Wow.
And this was drawn from the archive. So nothing had subtitles, everything had to be earphone translated. It was quite arduous and difficult. I helped out by doing some of the earphone translations. I was begged by Jeremy Barmay, who was one of the main translators at the event, to give him some relief by taking over a few of them for him, which I did. With scripts. My Chinese was nothing like good enough to do it extempore as he did. Anyway, the thing began to mushroom, and people began to become more aware that there was a Chinese film history and that it was worth exploring, because there were quite a number of interesting and even outstanding titles in it. So in 1985, we agreed with the National Film Theatre and the BFI to do a second bigger event, this time drawing on the archival titles that we didn't have access to first time around. So we were able to do a much bigger thing. It was spread over 2 months, January and February. And again, we were stuck without subtitles, so we had to do simultaneous translation for most of the films. The silent films had intertitles, so we were able to just do a loudspeaker translation of those things. But any talkies we had to do earphone translations for. So it was quite arduous for the audience. And for us, actually, for me in particular, because I had to perform most of them.
Sure, like a marathon.
Yes, it went on and on. But it was definitely worthwhile. We were able to show quite a number of 30s classics, some 40s classics, and some interesting but probably less classic films from the 1950s and the early 60s before the Cultural Revolution. And for sake of courtesy to the Chinese, we had to show some recent films which frankly were nothing like the high standard of the earlier stuff, to demonstrate that Chinese cinema was still alive and kicking.
Yep.
So we slogged through it, and it was a very hardcore event in a sense, in that it demanded enormous loyalty and perseverance from the audience to come back night after night to see more Chinese films. But they did, they came. I mean, some film, it was noticeable that the post-communist films, the post-1949 films, attracted smaller audiences than the pre-communist films from the 30s and 40s. That was not surprising to me, really. But nonetheless, they did attract an audience. People were curious to see. And in the accompanying documentation, we tried to build up the sense that there were certain underlying continuities to Chinese cinema. For example, I mean, this is a webcast called Cinema of Ideas, where we should perhaps stress one idea here, which is that people think that there was a big turning point in Chinese cinema in 1949 after the communist victory, that everything turned very strongly in the direction of Soviet socialist realism. Let's say the main influence at that time was Soviet cinema. Yep. That was the big communist cinema that served as a model. It had already happened in the late 40s in the first liberated areas in the northeast of China, the former Manchuria, where the films, the sort of progressive or leftist films made in the late 40s were clearly Soviet in influence. So they had a palpable Soviet sense to them. So people think that that was the dominant thing in Chinese cinema right through to the Cultural Revolution. Yes, it's true to a large extent, and China did begin sending filmmakers to Moscow for training, the Moscow Film School. However, as we've been demonstrating, there was a much more interesting current, I would say more interesting, sorry, this is probably controversial, a more interesting current that came from leftist filmmaking or progressive filmmaking generally in Shanghai in the 30s and 40s. And that also continued in Chinese cinema. So there were actually two schools contending. There was the sort of Soviet-Russian influence on one kind of filmmaking, and most of that was more militant propaganda type filmmaking. And there was a more entertainment-oriented, softer cinema, which obviously was not going to be politically daring, but it would make more than a few concessions to the sensibilities of an audience seeking entertainment. I think it's fair to say that the first kind, the Soviet-Russian stuff, was aimed more at inland areas of China, where there was a much lower level of education, a much lower level of prosperity. There were very few cinemas, and so the communists had to invent what they called barefoot cameramen or barefoot projectionists, who would travel with portable cameras and generators, not cameras, projectors, with generators to remote villages to give people their first film show. And the films they showed were, on the whole, from that Soviet tradition.
I wonder what kind of scale that was on.
Quite a large scale.
I mean,
I don't know the numbers,
thing.
but there were enormous numbers of barefoot projectionists who were sent out into the hinterland, because film was seen, you know, China this time had no television, it had only local radio in the big cities, basically. And so film was, for the communists, a very important mass media.
Sure, very accessible.
And so they had, but unfortunately, the cinemas in China were all along the East Coast. It was basically up from, you know, Tianjin and Beijing in the north, right down to Hong Kong in the south, through Shanghai and Nanjing and all of these East coastal cities. And that meant that a very high percentage of the Chinese population had never seen a film. They'd never had access to a film. So the Communist Party made it a priority to bring the films to the people. That meant the barefoot projectionists came into being, and they were sent out into these remote communities. And obviously they had to show films that would be comprehensible to their audience. So sophisticated stuff, with witty dialogue and play on bourgeois tropes. No way. They needed simple, didactic, educational, political movies that would tell people what this newfangled Communist Party was all about.
Sell it. Sell the party.
Yes. So that's what happened. Anyway, the interesting thing to us, I think, in looking at it as distant observers, is that these two currents were not in competition exactly, but they existed in uneasy truce side by side. And there was a very clear, particularly in the city of Shanghai, which had been the center of filmmaking in the 30s and 40s, there was a tendency to hanker after the older traditions and look not to the Soviet Russian models, but to their own models, which in turn were originally Hollywood influenced. So
more melodramas and
exactly so, yes. And sensuality. I mean, a certain pleasure in decor, in costume, in spectacle, in that kind of thing.
So you sort of, so this was kind of looking back at Chinese film history, but you're also looking forward. Last time we touched on you discovering An Hui and Choi Hark and people like this.
Well,
so what comes next in terms of you finding new voices in Chinese?
Okay, there are I have been lucky many times in my long and variegated history to be in the right place at the right time. So as I said, I went to the Hong Kong Festival for the first time in '77, I think, and then regularly from '79 onwards. And that was precisely coincident with the arrival of the so-called new wave in Hong Kong. The An Huis, the Choi Harks, the Alan Fongs, the Patrick Tams, all of these people made their first features around that time and made different kinds of accommodation with the mainstream. I mean, some of them shifted rather quickly into mainstream filmmaking for big companies, others did not. Others remained sort of independent or sort of rather outside the mainstream.
Was that because they wanted to stay outside?
It varied from person to person.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that. I mean, there was not a, even in France, where the first new wave really surfaced and attracted global attention, it was hard to think after about a year and a half that there was really much in common between Jean-Luc Godard, François Truffaut, Claude Chabrol. They were banded together with Rivette and some other names as representing a new wave in French cinema, but they had entirely different ambitions, entirely different ideologies.
Just a convenient label.
Yes. It was the same in Hong Kong. What An Hui wanted to do was nothing like what Choi Hak wanted to do. For example, and Alan Fong was the Ken Loach of Hong Kong in some sense, and he wanted to do something different again. So there was no commonality of stance or ambition even. It was just people wanted to do different things.
But were they changing, albeit in each one in a different style and appealing to different audiences and with a different voice? Was it giving kind of new filmmakers a sense that something new was possible? Shooting on the streets.
I think it definitely was, unarguably, was inspirational to other filmmakers, and that it encouraged people to believe that they could become filmmakers too. Most of the leading figures in the Hong Kong New Wave were people who had studied overseas at film schools. So An Hui, for example, had been at the London Film School, London International Film School, I think it's called now, and she had worked as an usherette at the National Film Theatre before, and then was briefly an assistant to King Hu, although he wasn't making a film at the time, and then became a TV director and then a feature film director. So that was her career trajectory. Choi Hak was born in Vietnam, raised in Hong Kong, studied in Texas at film school in Texas, worked briefly in New York Chinatown, and then came back to Hong Kong, again worked in television, and then made feature films. So Alan Fong studied in the University of Southern California and then came back to Hong Kong to make social realist films, sort of vaguely Loachian vein. So they all had different backgrounds, but most of them had in common was studying overseas. Which means they didn't come up through the old studio system in Hong Kong. They brought foreign ideas, foreign training with them. And it meant that the films they made were quite a lot different from what had been made in Hong Kong. Nearly all of them, with some exceptions, Choi Hak would be an obvious exception, they wanted to show social realities of Hong Kong as it then was. So they filmed on the streets, they filmed in Cantonese, they made films about real issues, they talked about real life cases, some were autobiographical, some focused on sensational crimes from the recent past. Some were fantastic, some were very realist, but
and what sort of freedom do they have?
Oh, total freedom at that time, as long as they could find somebody to pay for the film. I mean, but yes, there was nobody. There was for a time there was an excitement about new blood, and it was very influential. I mean, Shaw Brothers, which had been the monolith that dominated Hong Kong film culture for decades,
and completely studio bound.
Completely studio bound, allergic almost to showing anything of the realities of Hong Kong. Their films were always set in some fantasy historical China, which bore only the vaguest relationship with the political realities of China's history. So there was never any mention about political issues. The worst thing that would happen, you'd have a bad emperor in a movie who but not a symbolic, allegorical bad emperor. It would be not
carefully not.
Carefully not. So no, but Shaw Brothers stopped production in the mid-80s. I mean, it was only 5 years after the appearance of these so-called new wave directors
incredibly fast
that the big company gave up. They just thought, no, this is not our future anymore. They tried working with a couple of the new directors, didn't work out very well. They thought, let's stop. Let's move into television. We'll give over the big Shaw movie town complex to TV production, which is what they did and still do.
Which is phenomenal, really, in such a you space of time, isn't it? Yeah. And so you're seeing a lot of this work, and then you start jumping forward a bit. You then start to work with Vancouver.
That is a bit of a jump. I think I mentioned last time that I was seeing films mostly through the Hong Kong Film Festival and then through travels in the region, which I found interesting and I thought should be known in the West. I mean, they're certainly technically up to the standards that you would expect. They're also conceptually interesting, and they are revelatory about cultures of which we know little. So I think, you know, one of the useful things about film is that it is a conduit that allows you to understand other cultures, other backgrounds, other histories rather clearly. And so we should be doing that. It would be a good thing to do. I'm a committed internationalist in that sense. So in my travels, I would find films and then come back and recommend them to film festivals. So it happened initially in Britain, so London Film Festival and Edinburgh Film Festival in Scotland. I guess we had a certain measure of success doing that. It went on the whole rather well. And it meant that, for example, the Hong Kong New Wave films we've talked about, Choi Hak's first film was called Butterfly Murders. It played in Edinburgh, it played in London.
And would that have been one of the first places outside of Hong Kong, outside of China?
I think it was the first place.
Yeah.
I believe it was the first time that these films were ever seen outside Hong Kong. So I guess we built up a certain reputation for discovering some of these talents and presenting them to a Western audience. At the end of the 80s, I'd been once to Vancouver Film Festival. It used to have in its very early days, it had a section called Critics' Choice, and the then director asked me if I would be one of the critics making the choices, and it meant choosing 3 films. In my case, she asked me for 3 films from East Asia, and she said, "Please come to the festival and introduce the screenings, take part in discussions, that kind of thing." So I said, fine. I'd never set foot in Canada before, so I thought this was a nice thing to do. Did it. 2 years later, in '89.
Who did you remember who you picked?
One of them was certainly a film that's just had an online release of some kind in London, in Britain, called The New Morning of Billy the Kid, which is a film by a Japanese independent filmmaker called Yamakawa Naoto. A rather brilliant postmodern film in which it's a kind of allegory of good and evil with Western references. It takes place in a fantasy saloon, which is exactly like the kind of places that you find even now in Tokyo, themed places. So this is a bar themed like a Western saloon, and in this bar, a battle is fought between 5 heroes, 5 good guys, all drawn from different areas of Japanese pop culture. Or American pop culture as brought into Japan, and gangsters who are definitely foreign and brought into Japan as well as other kinds of influences. And they're the negatives, they're the bad guys. They dress in black, they have bad impulses, they have bad wishes, bad dreams, and the battle is fought out between the 2 of them. It's a very brilliant and imaginative film, I think. And
it goes down well.
It went down quite well. I think I can't say it took the place by storm, but it was certainly broadly well received. Yes. I don't remember the other 2 off the top of my head. Sorry.
But you were asked to come back, so that must have
by
gone
the
pretty
same
well.
people. There was a palace coup in the Vancouver Festival the following year. I heard that the director who invited me was ousted, and she was replaced by a gentleman called Alan Franey, who was, I think, originally a Brit. British Jewish, who had immigrated as a child, I think, to Canada. And he had been the manager of a small independent cinema called the Vancouver East Cinema. He was on the board of the festival, and when the previous director was ousted, he was invited to take over. So you have a situation here where there's a new director, and he approaches me at the beginning of '89. We're both at a festival in Europe, I think in Berlin, and he approaches me and asks me if I would like to do some programming for him. Would I program Asian cinema for him? And I said,
all of Asia.
I said, no, I can't. It's impossible. Asia is too big. There are too many things. And in particular, it includes Indian cinema, about which I know little. And I'm really not keen to spend weeks of the year in India looking at lots and lots of Indian films to try and find the ones that are suitable to bring to a festival like Vancouver, especially if I was spending a lot of time in East Asia, which is the area I'm mostly interested in. And he said, not a problem, he said, because we can take care of India by ourselves. What we need precisely is East Asia. Now, he didn't tell me this, but I strongly suspect that the local government people who are supporting the festival with subsidies and grants had said to him it would be quite a good idea to be Asia facing. The city is a Pacific city. Hands across the Pacific are what we want here. We'd like to be identified as an Asia-friendly city.
Something they really pulled off as well.
Yeah. Well, Vancouver already had quite a large Asian immigrant population, had even since the 30s.
Yeah.
So a long time.
Yeah.
But in the 70s, you were beginning to see immigration from Hong Kong. Other Chinese were coming to Vancouver. There had been Japanese in Vancouver for much longer, much longer, going back to the 20s and 30s. So, and then, by the time I started spending time in Vancouver, there were lots of Thais, there were lots of Filipinos, there were lots of Indonesians.
So it made a lot of sense to bring
lots
cinema.
Latterly, lots of Koreans. I mean, basically, it was becoming a visibly Asian city. You couldn't walk down any street in central Vancouver without coming across Asian passers-by. So, once we agreed, I mean, he explained that they had no money to pay for my travels, to help me research. But he thought, well, you go to Asia quite a lot anyway. At least
it seems familiar. People saying, could you please do it for free?
Could you do it on the back of your other work or your other travels? And I probably foolishly said, okay. And I attempted to program on that basis. What I rapidly found was that it was costing me a fortune. I couldn't afford to do it, basically. I had to go back to them and say, listen, this is not working out because I'm bankrupting myself by doing this job for you. And he started at that point to pay me a bit more to do the programming job, which made it possible to carry on. But I was never paid, reimbursed for any expenses, so hotel bills. Fortunately, I was able to stay with friends in many places. I worked for a while for Cathay Pacific Airways as an advisor. In those days we had in-flight entertainment, which was a single screen in each cabin. Yes. They needed advice on what films to show, and
So you were saying Ishisogo films, for example.
I wouldn't say it, but they would have fired me the next day. But you had to choose family-friendly films because it was a film for the whole cabin. If you showed something disturbing, there would be complaints. There would be the airline would be in trouble. It happened a few times. There were a film that I remember we showed a private function on a flight, which is the Alan Bennett scripted film about hiding a pig in wartime. It turned out to, Cathay Pacific at that time flew through the Middle East. All flights were touching down in Bahrain to refuel. Middle Eastern passengers were deeply offended by the pig. Right. The film had to be pulled overnight when it became apparent that there were complaints from one section of the traveling public about a film about a pig. All kinds of hidden pitfalls awaited us. But anyway, it did mean I could get free flights out of Cathay Pacific. So a certain amount of my regional traveling and my London to Hong Kong travels could be covered by that. So that was a boon and a blessing.
So did Vancouver did you go straight into programming the main, all the East Asian cinema across the festival, or did you start? I thought you'd started with doing a couple of retrospectives.
No, we did everything. We plunged in. The session got bigger as it went along. It was, but it was. We ended up showing something like 30 to 40 films in the program every year, and I think already that my chief interest was in supporting new filmmakers, new talents. But if you do that, you're courting box office disaster. You can't expect any audience anywhere in the world to be, curious enough to go and see dozens of, unknown directors making unknown, small, low-budget films with minimal resources and no big names attached to them. So I'm mindful of this. Of course, I would always try and offset inevitable losses on some of the smaller indie films with a few big name films by well-known directors, which I knew would be crowd pleasers and would help to balance the books, as it were. And that's always been my policy. Whenever I've done programming anywhere, I've actually tried to bear in mind the economics of it and tried to make sure that if you show something is not likely to attract a significant large audience, play something else that will attract a significant large audience to offset the losses on the first one. If you don't do that, you're out of business very quickly. I think you have some involvement in running the cinema yourself.
I do make these kinds of decisions myself now and again.
It must be very familiar.
Yes.
Yes.
But you're Vancouver starts to become a kind of an international, certainly a Western beacon for showing East Asian cinema.
People come, yes.
No other festivals in the world are showing quite the number of world premieres.
They aren't. And Alan Franey, as I said, the new director, comes to me after a few years, 3 years, I think, or 4 years, and says, listen, we seem to be premiering a lot of films here year after year. Maybe we should have a competition for new directors. And I said, yes, okay, but as long as it's got a cash prize. I mean, I'm not interested in doing a competition where people only win, some stupid trophy.
Yeah.
They happen. Well,
for their first-time filmmaker.
The thing that independent filmmakers need always is money. So we have to be able to give a cash prize, even if it's not a huge one. So Franey went away, and he came back with sponsors who paid for a cash prize, and it became possible to do it.
They were fairly serious amounts of money, weren't they?
Well, it wasn't huge,
10,000.
but it was decent.
Yeah.
It was okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it was certainly better than a poke in the eye with a sharp stick.
Yeah.
So we did that for 20 years finally. During the 20 years, a lot changed. I mean, I think we were quite successful. We showed 8 to 10 films in competition every year. We had quite distinguished juries, often including big name filmmakers.
Like who?
Jang Sunwoo, Bong Joon-ho, Hong Sang-soo. I mean, lots of quite big. Yi Chang-dong came and did it. Some of these people were former winners. Yi Chang-dong won our prize with his first feature, Green Fish, and then came back some years later as a jury member. So it was, we tried to strike a balance between different kinds of people, different kinds of films in the competition, but we were very conscious of trying to cement a certain commonality between the East Asian countries. The sad truth is the countries of East Asia are by and large ignorant of each other's films. There is very little tradition of cross distribution from country to country.
Right.
It happened briefly, well, not briefly, it happened for quite a long time with Hong Kong films. The only films that were widely seen across the region were Hong Kong films in the day. That's no longer true, and it stopped being true in the 1990s. But for quite a long time, distributors in every country in the region, right from Korea in the north down to Singapore in the south, were showing Hong Kong films.
Yeah.
So Hong Kong films had a wide regional audience and were widely accepted, led by the Chinese diaspora, but not exclusively confined to them. So one of the reasons that Hong Kong films routinely have subtitles in Chinese and English, even now, is because they were designed to appeal right across the region to people who were both Chinese speaking and needed the Chinese subtitles if they didn't happen to have the right dialect for the soundtrack, and English for the rest, on the assumption that most people would enjoy and be able to understand the English. So that lasted, as I say, until the 1990s. After that, to a small degree, Korean cinema took over. There was a brief period when Thai cinema did quite well and was widely exported, but that was very short-lived. And now we're back to the old status quo, which is that very, very few films find audiences in other countries, neighboring countries in the region. So one of the things in Vancouver I wanted to do was to try and forge links. I mean, we were able to bring in quite a large number of filmmakers each year. I wanted to make sure that they met each other, that they saw each other's films if possible, that they, had some kind of interesting conversations, discussions, and so on. And it worked out quite well.
Do you mean this sort of in a private way? So
yes, in a private way. I wouldn't try to.
It wasn't.
I'm not going to overtax the audience in Vancouver. I mean, there's a limit to how much they would be interested in Asian solidarity or East Asian solidarity. They want to see films. My job is to be as positive as possible, to sell the films. As I said, I'm very conscious that I'm showing quite a significant number of unknown indie films, small films, which have no reputation preceding them. Nobody knows what they are. Nobody's heard of them before. I've chosen them because I believe they will be enjoyed by a Western audience, a predominantly Western audience. But my job is to describe them, to write about them in such a way that brings out their attractive qualities. So I'm not really writing as a critic when I do festival catalogue work. I'm writing as a promoter.
But only because you've already shown something and programmed something that you critically think is interesting.
Obviously so, yes. But I'm not
That's not your
I'm
job.
not, I'm not,
Festival's
I'm
rolling.
not addressing
Yeah.
a critical readership. I'm not interested in persuading people of the rightness of
Yeah.
my point of view or the accuracy of my analysis or any of that stuff. I just want to convince people that they're going to have a good time if they take a risk on this unknown film.
And given that you're one of, at this point, Vancouver is one of the few festivals in the world deeply engaging with work from East Asia, what's the sort of time frame? I mean, when it starts to, because now, obviously, a lot of festivals all over the world show this work. And how did that happen? How do you think that happened in terms of the other festivals noticing what you were doing, or is it because of the filmmakers going on to make more visible work?
Well, okay, things did change. From my 10 years after we started the competition in Vancouver for new directors, the situation was much changed. I think most East Asian filmmakers, before they even shot a single frame of their film, would give some thought to where they wanted to premiere it. That was not the case when we started doing this. People were starting to think, oh, is this film going to be good for Berlin? Is this film going to be for Cannes or Locarno? Where could I premiere my film? And they start thinking in those terms and try to make contact with those terms. This is led by the fact that, partly because of Vancouver, I'm not claiming any big credit for this, but it's true that after people did notice what was going on in the Vancouver program, and people came to look at it.
So other festival programmers.
We had quite a number of festival programmers coming to look and see what we were doing, and word spread, fairly rapidly. And because of that, I think that some scouts from major festivals, particularly from Cannes, started traveling more in East Asia themselves. They were not necessarily experts in the cinemas of those regions, those countries, but they became curious to find things that might fit into the Cannes ethos. I'm rather cynical about the Cannes ethos myself, but that we don't need to go there. However, the fact is that scouts began to appear, and suddenly I was not the only one trekking around these countries, spending weeks and weeks looking at dozens of films, trying to find interesting things to bring back to the West. I mean, I don't think I was ever the only one, but I was certainly probably the most assiduous, I think, for a number of years. But suddenly I would bump into people I knew. I mean, suddenly who were on the same mission, So it was clear that we were having some impact, that people were sitting up and taking at least some notice of this. And as I said, the filmmakers themselves were noticing as well, because they were becoming more ambitious after decades of not being used to showing their films overseas, in fact, fighting obstacles to getting them shown overseas. Suddenly, they were getting invitations from more than one place. And as I said, it provoked a certain kind of ambition and a certain kind of expectation. And Vancouver is, I mean, it's a quite large festival. We would show 400 to 500 films in a year, so it's a large event. But it's not a business festival in the way that Toronto is. It doesn't have a giant market. It's not geared to
buying and selling films for distribution,
and it's certainly not interested in premiering stuff that is going to be released next week anyway. Which is the bane of many festivals.
Preview stuff.
They're used as promotional tools basically by distributors. So
with the visibility of Vancouver rising and you're traveling, are you finding that more filmmakers are coming to you rather than you going out and finding films? Filmmakers are coming to you.
I said before, I was lucky to be in the right place at the right time more than once. The next example after Hong Kong would probably be Taiwan, because I was lucky enough to meet Edward Yang, who became a very close friend of mine in the early 80s, just as the Taiwan New Wave, so-called, was getting going. So I met him and Hou Xiaoxian, they were close friends at the time, and they helped each other with their films, and they were the nucleus of a new movement in Taiwan cinema. And then, of course, in China, where the so-called fifth generation surfaced in the mid-80s. So I guess I was one of the first audiences that saw Yellow Earth, for example, which was the breakthrough film of the first generation, and met Chen Kai-ge, Zhang Yimou, who were the two key people behind that film, and subsequently met quite a number of other leading filmmakers, Tian Zhuangzhuang, who made Horse Thief, which was his breakthrough film, I guess, and quite a few others too. And again, it was the luck of being in the right place at the right time. So, you know, forming friendships with some of these people, spending time with them socially, you know, hanging out. When I was visiting China, they would invite me to their place and we'd have dinners, this kind of thing. So I found myself kind of involved in some degree with their progress, with their work. I would see the films, I would offer comments, advice, maybe.
So maybe rough cuts, you mean? Or...
No, I don't think I ever saw rough cut, but people want to know, is this suitable for showing in such and such a place? Or such
will it travel?
Or, So that kind of advice, some simple practical advice about what might be a good strategy for getting this film out to the world. But then, you know, no Chinese filmmaker before the mid-80s had really thought about such questions. It was not the norm. You know, filmmakers had no control over their work and no ambitions for their work beyond China. So it was a new thing for them.
What about someone, you know, famously, at least famously to me, and I'm sure to lots of people, you know, a picture pong. Tell us about how you came to know him.
I was attending Thailand and Bangkok, where, you know,
on your
part of my regular agenda. I would try and visit Thailand whenever I could, and was curious about Thai cinema, although a bit despondent about, you know, the everyday output of Thai cinema in the 80s.
I remember you telling me that you were always sort of thinking it's just on the cusp of innovating in some way.
Exactly. I think that's correct. I believe that. I still think that now. One time I was attending the premiere of a film produced by a friend, a film by Manop Udomdek called Beyond Forgiving. It was a kind of revenge thriller, but sort of slightly arty. I wouldn't go too far with that, but
it's arty genre film.
Yes, it was. It was a genre film, but it was.
Sounds like it's got a picture pong written all over it.
Well, it was. The basic concept was a killer, a hitman, falls in love with a woman who sells insurance.
Okay.
It's I thought that was quite witty and a good premise for a genre busting film to some degree. And anyway, Manop Udomdek was a kind of friend of mine. He was from an independent filmmaking background. I'd seen his first film projected onto the wall of a hotel room in Bangkok some years previously, and he'd made a film called On the Fringe of Society, which I brought to the London Film Festival that year. Which was a kind of underground film, you could call it. It had some sponsorship from one of the religious charities, but it was about the difficulties faced by people in Isan in the northeast of Thailand. So he'd begun making indie films like that with a sort of political edge to them. So he'd become a friend. I'd followed his progress with some interest, and he made this film Beyond Forgiving. I go to the premiere. I happen to be in Bangkok when the film premieres. I go to the premiere. The cinema is a little complex at the top of a department store, which is the common for most Asian multiplexes in Thailand are like that. And I'm standing around in the lobby as people are doing the red carpet thing, and the stars are arriving, and the director is arriving, the producer is arriving, star guests are arriving. And somebody comes out of the crowd and comes up to me and thrusts a little package into my hand and says in English, "Please see my film." This is Apichatpong. And he's giving me a VHS copy of a work in progress of his first feature, Mysterious Object at Noon. I say thank you very much. Just put a telephone number on the outside of the package. I go back to the friend I'm staying with in Bangkok and watch the film next day on the VHS player.
You see, that's a pretty interesting thing for you to say, because you're the speed with which you're watching it.
Oh, I'm watching it next day, because I'm curious about it.
Exactly, it's that curiosity.
It hasn't happened before in Bangkok, so it's the first time in Bangkok somebody has done that.
But how many times do we get filmed?
The film is amazing. The film is quite unlike any other Thai film. It's a very sophisticated, surrealist film, you could say, which poses as a realist film but becomes increasingly surreal as it goes along, and poses as a documentary and becomes increasingly fictional as it goes along, until the end when it does a U-turn back into documentary. So it's a singular piece of work, and a very interesting and fascinating one. And I call him up and I say, "It's amazing. I'd love to show this film in Vancouver. Can I show it? I'd have it in my competition in Vancouver if you like." And he said, "Oh, you'd have to show it with time coding because it's not finished, it's not ready, and it won't be ready by then." So I said, well, then we'll wait a year, I think, because I'd rather not go with time code.
It would be horrendous watching the time code.
Yes.
First time.
So, but it was the beginning of a great friendship with Apichatpong, which lasts till the present. And, you know, some Koreans a few years ago very kindly made a documentary about me to celebrate my long involvement with Korean cinema. And it begins largely through a happy accident with a film of Apichatpong giving a lecture at the Busan Film Festival,
which I was at. That lecture.
You were, I was not at, so you have the advantage on me.
I remember seeing your face coming up.
But Apichatpong started off his talk talking about me, to my surprise, and I learned only later when I arrived in Busan that this had happened, so I was kind of astonished. But anyway, he spoke about the work of a scout, somebody who goes around looking for films and then tries to find interesting and talented work and then tries to promote it in every way possible. I mean, you know, I made it very clear to filmmakers from the very beginning, I'm not a businessman. I'm not going to buy your film. I'm not Pierre Rissière, the famous Frenchman who also went around East Asia looking for films to promote, but he wanted to have a financial interest in them. He wanted to, which almost always ended badly. It ended very badly with Nino Brockett and very badly with King Hu. There were other examples too of it not being a happy liaison because it was rooted in business. I never had any business involvement and never wanted any business involvement. And I've never lied to filmmakers that I can build them up into something or guarantee them this or that kind of success. It's never worked like that. All I've said is I can help you to get the film seen, you know, and
which is a major thing.
I'll try to present it in the best possible light, best possible context, but you know, I make no promises about anything. So when any filmmaker came to Vancouver, I tried to make sure that at the very least they went back with some quotable review in positive terms of the film. So we worked very hard with the local press. We had a local volunteer, a Chinese guy, whose job was specifically to liaise with the local press, including the ethnic languages press, to promote our films in particular, the East Asian section in particular, to try and guarantee that there will be interest and that there will be something that the filmmaker could take back, because it was not likely that they would ever be able to sell the film on the basis of a Vancouver screening, but at the least I wanted to make sure they would take back something that might help them in promotion or, you know, raise their profile in some way. The best thing I could offer in most cases was either an invitation to another festival from Vancouver so their progress into the outer world could continue, or at least a viable press quote that they could use in their promotion, their publicity.
Yeah, good stuff. Tony, as ever, I'm aware that it's now, we've got 10 minutes for questions.
Oh
how did that happen? Happened last time.
Because I talked too much, I'm sorry.
So I can see that some questions are coming up here, so I'm going to just...
I'm in your hands, you go for it.
So, question from Chris Eves. I would love to know more about your friendship with Edward Yang and perhaps to hear about what you consider to be his philosophy towards filmmaking at the time and his main cinematic influences. His film Mahjong is one of my absolute favorites. Wish I could have been a fly on the wall for some of your conversations in the 1980s.
Well, I don't know if you're aware of a DVD and Blu-ray publishing label called Criterion, who are basically an American label based in New York, but they now have a Criterion UK arm, which publishes a lot of stuff. One of the discs they published a couple of years ago was Edward Yang's A Brighter Summer Day, which is his biggest and longest film. They published the original 4-hour cut of the film, which is of course more suitable for Blu-ray than it is for theatre, I guess. I was asked by Criterion to do a commentary track for this film. At first I declined, as it's 4 hours long. Who wants to listen to a 4-hour commentary? It's madness.
Not to mention quite exhausting to do.
Yes, very exhausting to do, but I think equally exhausting for a viewer who tunes into it. But they said, well, you know, we've shown it in the office to our team, you know, and they all find it very confusing. They can't tell who is who or what's going on or why these things are happening. And we think it would be very helpful to have a commentary that would clarify it for the benefit of Westerners who can't quite make out who these people are and why they're doing these terrible things to each other. So I said, okay, maybe a spot commentary, maybe I'll do some scenes in it. But once I knuckled down to it, it became clear that there would have to be basically a 4-hour commentary. However, I remembered that although I'd visited the shooting of Brighter Summer Day a couple of times, 3 times I think, in different locations, and I ended up helping Edward with the subtitles for the film when it was finished. I also had received a large number of faxes from, this was the day of the fax.
Sure.
It's before email, so you know.
Should we explain what a fax is?
Well,
No.
I'll leave that to you. You can add a footnote later. But I had a whole bulging file like this of faxes from Edward Yang, complaining about the financial difficulties, about creative problems, about this and that actor being difficult, or whatever, or why this wasn't working, or this was working, or you know what else was going on. And I still had these stuff, and it had all been private. It was a private correspondence with me. So I decided to use some parts of it in the commentary for A Brighter Summer Day, for the Criterion disc. And I read out quite long sections of these letters, these faxes from Edward, because I thought, sadly, he's dead, so it's not possible to have his voice on the commentary for this film. But at least I can offer his words, if not his voice, because it'll be me reading his words, but at least it's better than nothing, I thought. So I don't know if I answered your question comprehensively. It would take the rest of the evening, and I can't,
4 hours.
We can't do
like
that.
Edward Yang commentary track.
I can just say that I met Edward at the early 80s. He was an extraordinarily nice man, very forthcoming. My Chinese was weak at the time. It's probably still not very good now, but at least, but then it was really, this is 40 years ago. So it's a lot of water has gone under the bridge since then. He, fortunately, having studied in the States, spoke excellent English. So he was one of the first people I met in Taiwan with whom there was absolutely no communication problem. And that cemented a friendship, I guess. And so, he stayed in my place in London on one of his visits after I think screening his films in Edinburgh. I stayed in his place in Taipei. I helped him with subtitles routinely. I followed the films. I met his associates. I, worked in his office sometimes. I helped him writing synopses and press kits, this kind of stuff. So we had a social and intellectual friendship. I think he saw me as a friend and ally, and it was a close relationship until he succumbed to cancer. In his final years, he sadly detached himself from everything. He moved to the States, to California, in search of superior medical treatment, which he hoped would head off the cancer. Sadly, it didn't. So, but he leaves a widow and a son. And I still see the widow sometimes. Her name is Tang Kai Li, and she used to be a concert pianist at one time, but she doesn't do that anymore. But she's now trying to reinvent herself as a producer.
Okay.
But she's hampered by China's politics. She wanted to support new directors in China by encouraging them producing their films, but
the current climate is
China doesn't let you do that. So everything is very, very, very tightly controlled in China these days. So sadly, she's been left without any modus operandi. There's nothing she can do to fulfill her wishes.
Okay.
Sorry,
another question.
Very sketchy answer to your question. Sorry about that, sir.
I haven't been able to find a way to watch Mahjong, but I wanted to ask about your experience making the 1999 film. Oh, sorry, I haven't been able to find the film Away with Words, but I wanted to ask you about your experience making this.
Away with Words.
Yeah, how did you navigate?
It was an absolute nightmare. It was one of the worst experiences of my life.
I remember you, being unhappy about this.
Christo was a friend. I guess he's still a friend in a certain sense, although we're not in regular contact anymore. But for quite a number of years, we were rather close friends in Hong Kong. I was frequently in Hong Kong. I would sometimes stay in his place when my regular hotel, for example, closed down for redecoration and renovation. He said, "Come and stay in my place," and I did. He was wild and crazy. He was closely associated with Wong Kar-wai at that time, before they had a big bust up. Because he was working on advertising projects in Japan, he got money from a Japanese distributor who was somebody who had distributed Wong Kar-wai films in Japan to make his own feature. And he came to me and asked me if I would help him write it. I said, okay, and the concept was his. The basic idea was quite a good one. I thought it was a man who can't remember what he did yesterday because he drinks too heavily, meets a man who can't forget anything, who has total recall, total memory of everything. And I thought this was a promising setup for a film.
Yeah.
I thought we can go with that. So I wrote a script with him and for him. A lot of it I ended up writing alone, basically. Much later, I found out he never read the script.
Wow.
So the finished film,
Really?
there's only very, very, very sketchy relationship to the script as written. I remember he was editing as he went along, and I wasn't able to be there for the main part of the filming, but I remember coming back towards the end of the filming and him saying, you know, I'm having big trouble with the ending. I've got to do something to brush up the ending, to make the ending work better. And I said, you're not kidding. I've just had a look at the rough cut, and it's a disastrous ending. You know, I don't want to big up the script, but you could think about going back to what we had in the script. At least it would tie up the loose ends in the narrative. It would be, it has. And he stared at me blankly, and I realised he didn't know what the ending of the script was.
Oh my goodness!
He never read it. Had no idea about it. Wow. Chris is a somewhat erratic personality. Let's put it like that. And it was the film, I think, is catastrophically bad. The film is appallingly chaotic. It's incoherent. It's full of very misjudged things and elements, not least the female lead. Somebody else was scheduled for the film, but they had a row before filming started, she and the director, and she departed immediately. The replacement casting was some Singaporean girl who was a Wong imitator, right. Trying to be a singer, and had never acted in her life. And
sounds like a perfect choice.
She was, after the first day of her filming, she was so bad, so catastrophically bad, that Chris said, maybe you can talk to her, maybe you can give her some kind of briefing push, a little.
You should have given her the script, Tony.
She had been given a script. I don't know if it was mine. We had a talk, and I tried to explain the character to her, and she looked at me blankly and said, but that's not me. And I realized that this young lady had not had any understanding what acting meant.
Okay, problematic.
She the notion of playing a role in a film was alien to her or new to her.
Right. Yeah.
So
maybe
a lot of the problems sprang from situations like that. I mean, we can go on all night with anecdotes about this, but I don't recommend you to see the film, and I don't recommend you to look into it too deeply. It was a miserable experience for everybody, and inevitably it sank without trace. It was I think the only country it was released in was Japan, which paid for it.
Right. Okay. On that really positive note. I think we've sort of come to the end of our time here. But I just wanted to thank you so much. I mean, we were thinking about talking about your work in blue. I mean, we touched on commentary tracks with every gang. We were thinking of talking on this, but let's see what the future holds, Tony. Maybe we'll do another one. I don't know. But thank you so much.
We can't tax people's patience too much. I think it's been incredible that we've asked them to listen to 2 hours of this rambling nonsense.
We can't see, so there might be no one out there, Tony.
It's possible, but there are some questions
might have gone down
by the screen. So who knows? Who are these people? I mean, what masochism drives them to listen to me wittering on like this? Anyway, apologies for
at the last minute, the questions come through about what do you think of the works of the 5th generation of film directors. That's a big question.
It is.
So maybe we should save that for part 3.
Oh yes, sure. Yes, why not?
So I think I'm going to.
Sorry, no time now.
I think we're going back to Catherine at this point.
I was going to say that, so thank you very much, the person who sent that last question, which is, we'll hold you on tenterhooks, but is a great question, and I want to hear the answer to that. So I'm afraid you might have to come back. That has been such a fantastic conversation. I never thought I'd hear you talk about. I never thought this evening I'd be hearing about a private function.
It's a really good tip for people programming on for airlines, right?
Well, now it's different, because in them days you had a single screen at the front of each cabin, and they would show an 8mm copy of the film onto this screen for everybody in that cabin. Now, of course, you have multiple choice personal screens, so it's not an issue anymore. The notion of selection is much broader now, and you have to offer people a choice.
Excuse me, I'm just going to sell this on behalf of Tony, because this person I've just noticed is asking about 5th gen filmmakers. And this is an amazing box set of Zhang Yimou and Gong Li's collaborations. So I don't know why I did that, Tony. I just thought people should know about it.
It has a connection with me.
People should really know about it. Yeah, Tony's all over it in terms of extras and so on. Just, yeah. I just got it the other day and I'm really excited. It's not out of its wrapping.
Oh. And I think that personally, I would like a whole COI episode dedicated to your collaboration with Crystal.
Oh, God.
I actually have a copy of this film. I don't know, that sounds like a threat, doesn't it?
It does, yes. Good, that's my advice.
We're going to do that as a cult screening.
He does put in the credits based on a script by, so at least I'm not wholly to blame for it, but it's embarrassing enough to have my name on the damn thing.
Oh, it sounds fun. I just want to hear more. So thank you so much to you both. Really, really wonderful to have you together again on the platform. And I think we might have to try and persuade you to come back to, like, at least maybe edging and answer its amazing question about the 5th generation of Chinese film directors, if only that. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that's joined us this evening. Tony mentioned there the Criterion collection. So our next conversation with our programming conversation, if you like, is with curatorial director at the Criterion collection, Ashley Clark. And that will be coming to the platform on 8th of Feb. So we will be letting you know the details about that nearer the time. He'll be in conversation with Charlotte Cook from Fields of Vision. So if you've enjoyed tonight, please do come back for that. But we will have some more conversations, try and persuade Tony to come back and share more stories with us. Until then, thank you so much to you both for this evening. Thank you especially to Tony for coming and sharing all your knowledge, your experience.
Thank you for having us.
Great stories.
It's been
Thanks very much. And good night.
Fortitude is immense.
Bye-bye.